Well, welcome back. This is episode 2 of the introductory photography series. Last time I kind of gave a once over of basic SLR photography, which that video turned out to be around 50 minutes long. It's a bit long for the average viewer. So I decided to follow that video up with a few more videos, summing up individual pieces of what photography is as a basic art and as a basic science, and chop those up into several smaller videos. So this is the first video on that, and this is our probably most important video, and it's about exposure. So without further ado, I will start to explain what basic exposure is. Now, film that you load into a camera. This is what you typically look like if you're working with 35 millimeter film. This is a 135 cartridge, Retina cassette for collectors, if you know what that is. It's fine. This one is actually a test cartridge that I have here, so it doesn't matter if I expose this to light, but you generally don't want to do that with a good roll of film that you actually plan on using. Anyway, every film that you will get for your camera, regardless of whether it is 135, if it's roll film, like this is an antique 620 roll film here, or 120, which this is an empty spool of, even up to large formats, which are like sheet films and stuff for big old-fashioned cameras. Every single film that you will get has a specific sensitivity. Now, that sensitivity dictates how sensitive the light is, the film is to light. A faster film is going to be more sensitive to light, and a slower film is going to be less sensitive to light. We measure that with a number called ASA or ISO. They both nowadays mean pretty much the same thing, but I use the term ASA because it's more precise for what I'm trying to describe. If you are actually interested in that, probably I'll do a video about that in the future, but whatever. Anyway, this film here is Ilford XP2, and you'll notice it says in large numerals there, 400. That is the speed of the film. This film is 400 ASA or 400 ISO. A slower film, let's say Fomapan 100, like I currently usually bulk load. This is a bulk loader that I use to fill these sort of refillable cassettes with film. I'll get into that in a later video. That is going to be much less sensitive to light than your 400 speed film would be. Anyway, to have a properly exposed image, you need three things to coincide with each other. And we usually draw this as a triangle. Exposure now. This is what we call the exposure triangle. And there's, of course, three corners to a triangle, and each corner represents something different. So on the top, we have the ASA or ISO. I'll put ISO there to remind you. On this side, we have the aperture. I'll get to what that is in a second. And then shutter speed on this corner. Now we need all three of these elements to work in conjunction to get proper exposure. And basically what proper exposure means is the film has a fixed speed, in this case 400 or whatever it may be, and through manipulation of the shutter speed and the aperture, you can moderate the amount of light that gets to the film. If you let too much light get to the film, the highlights will wash out and there won't be much detail in the photo. If you underexpose the film, you don't let enough light information to the film, and your shadows will be completely darkened, only the highlights will show out, and the photo will usually not even turn out in the first place. So it's kind of important that you get these three elements to work together in conjunction. So, first thing I want to explain is the halves rule. Each time you take a fixed exposure and you double it or you halve it, we call that going up or down one stop. So I'll explain here with this antique lens and shutter that I have, which actually makes it easy to display this concept. You'll notice here on the top, there's a dial that allows me to set various shutter speeds on this lens. So like if I set it to 1, that means it is going to be set at 1 second. So this lens will be open for, oh, it's a bit slow. Yeah, this one's a bit slow. All right, plan B. A different antique lens. If I set this dial to 1 second, the lens will stay open for 1 second, or roughly thereabout. This is a pneumatically regulated shutter, so it's a bit wonky in its timing, but just pretend that's exactly 1 second. Likewise, if I turn this dial down to 100, that is actually a fraction. That is not 100 seconds, it is 1/100th of a second. So naturally, if I cock the shutter and fire it, put my hand behind there so you can see it, that is 1/100th of a second. You'll see that these numbers on both of these shutters are in a special series. That's 1, 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, 100, 200. Now that's an older series. Your camera is likely newer and will probably have a different series that kind of looks like 30, 60, 125, 250, 500. But basically, if you take the numbers that are closest to each other, like 200 and 250, 100 and 125, 50 and 60, this all applies to the same thing. It's just at one point we decided collectively that we're going to use a new set of numbers, but don't think too hard about it. Anyway, these numbers, you'll notice, either double themselves or halve themselves, depending on the way that I turn the dial. So like 50 is twice the amount of 25 and half the amount of 100. Like I said, each step in this is called one stop. So the 1/25th setting will give me twice the amount of light as the 1/50th setting. That means I am allowing one more stop of light through the lens. Likewise, if I put this to 100, that's half the amount of light that's going through, as in 1/50th of a second. Remember, because it's a reciprocal number. It's 1/100th versus 1/50th. That means I am darkening it by one stop. I'm letting one stop less light through the lens. Now to demonstrate the, there we go, that works on the shorter speeds. To demonstrate the next portion, that's shutter. This is aperture. If I open up this lens, you'll notice that there is nothing to constrict the light that's going through it. It's just wide open. It might actually be easier to show you on this. Yeah, there we go. It's easier to show you on this. There's nothing to constrict the light from going through this lens. But there is this lever on the bottom that allows you to stop down the lens. Now this is an iris mechanism that constricts the amount of light that's actually able to pass through the lens. And you'll see that there are a number of numbers that are engraved along the bottom here. And they're also in a funky sequence, just like the shutter speeds were. But this is a little bit different of a sequence. You'll notice every other number doubles itself. That's not really important. There's a mathematical reason why, to do with area and division and stuff, but just take it for granted that this is the series that you're usually going to see. Like 5, 6, F8, F11, F16, F22, F32. Well, why am I saying F, first of all? Why am I saying F4.5, F5.6, F8? What does that mean? Well, F, you'll see I drew a squiggly F here. The squiggly F is used in, or like italic cursive F, is used in mathematics to denote a function, which is just a formula. So if I actually write the formula out to calculate F, you'll see why. Your F number is equal to the focal distance, the focal length of your lens, divided by the diameter of your aperture. So if I take, for example, here, this is an easy lens to show you on. Actually, I'll get my paper back so you can see through the lens. This is a lens for a 35mm rangefinder camera, and it is 50 millimeters. That's its focal length, which is the center, the optical center of the lens, to the film plane in the camera, that distance is going to be 50 millimeters. And I'll explain what that means in a later video about fields of view and stuff. But anyway, the maximum aperture of this lens is f1.5, and it stops down to f16. You'll see that's a much smaller dot of light than when I open it up. What does that mean? Well, if I set this to f2, if I look at my formula here, the focal length divided by this diameter, which is that circle that you see there, is equal to the f number. Therefore, the diameter of this lens, of the aperture, is exactly half the amount of the focal length. So in that case, this is going to be 25 millimeters. So if I actually take a ruler out here, I can look up 25 millimeters, and yeah, what do you know? That matches exactly. It's 25 millimeters. Same thing here. If I set that to f4, it's going to take 4 times. So that's going to be 12.5 millimeters. And if I look at that again, yep, 12.5 millimeters. So basically, since every time that you have the diameter of your iris here, you actually quarter the amount of light going through, which is why every other number doubles itself. There's these intermediate numbers. So it goes f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16. Each number that I'm showing you there, with the exception of the first one, so we'll just ignore that, pretend it doesn't exist. Each one of these numbers here, or on the big chunky lens I have here, each number that I open that up or close it down, that actually either doubles or halves the amount of light that goes through. Wait a second, that sounds familiar. Isn't the shutter doing the same thing? Yes, it is. And that's actually the basis behind basic exposure here. Every time that you double the shutter speed to get the same exposure, you can actually open up one stop here. That's right. Since these are in stops and this is in stops, we can actually trade shutter stops for aperture stops and aperture stops for shutter stops. So to get the same exposure, let's say f8 at 1/50th of a second is proper exposure for the given conditions and film. If I want to get a wider depth of field, let's say, I would want to stop down. And depth of field I'll get to in a later video, but basically it's how much of your scene will be in focus. And if you stop down further to a smaller aperture, like we see here with f16, the depth of field will be widened. But you'll see, look, I stopped it down by 2 stops. That means there's 1/2 and then 1/2 again, or 1/4, the amount of light going through the lens. So to remain properly exposed, I have to give the shutter, make the shutter 2 stops slower. So I'll slow this down to 1/10th of a second. I close this down by 2 stops, reducing the amount of light by 2 stops, and then I slowed down the shutter, increasing the amount of light by 2 stops. Therefore, this has the same exposure. Likewise, if I'll put this back at f8 at 50, if I want to get a shallower depth of field, or let's say I want to capture some faster action with a higher shutter speed, I'll open up by 1 stop to f5.6, and since that's letting twice the amount of light through, I need to have that amount with the shutter again, so I'll twist that to 100. And therefore, our proper exposure is maintained. Remember, it's important to get the proper exposure so you don't either blow out the film or don't give the film enough exposure information to create an image in the first place. Now, how do you get exposure in the first place? Like, how do you know what the proper exposure is for a given scene? That's actually much easier than you think. There's just 4 individual conditions you have to memorize. And I'll draw this out for you. There's sun. There is partly sunny or partly cloudy, whatever. Or generally speaking, we call this hazy. Cloudy, overcast. And then kind of a darker overcast. If it's ever raining, kind of, and you get that look, you get that feeling, it's like, oh, it's turning dark. That's what this means. So basically, if it's sunny, if there's hard shadows, this is what we consider sunny. If there's just a little bit of cloud coverage, and there's still shadows, but they're a little bit softer, that's hazy. If there's no shadows, but it's still pretty bright, that's overcast. And if it's dark, like rainy kind of, that's dark overcast. Now, this rule I'm about to explain to you is called the Sunny 16 rule. And it's way easier than you'd think it would be. Let's take into account this film here. It's ASA 400. First step you're going to do is you're going to take your camera. I do not have one here. Actually, I do have one here. Here we go. Here's a Minolta autocord. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take our shutter speed and we're going to set that to the closest number that we have to our ASA. So I'm going to set mine to 1/500th of a second in this window here. That's step one. Step two is you need to memorize 4 numbers. 16, 11, 8, and 5.6. That's all you need to know, and you're going to be good. Sunny 16. What does that mean? Well, if it's sunny out, if there's hard shadows, you then set, for ASA 400 film, since we already set the shutter speed at 500, we're going to now set our aperture to f16. And I just set the aperture to f16. Boom, I'm now ready to take my photo. Cool. Oh no, all of a sudden, some clouds rolled in and it's completely overcast now. f8, I'm just going to open up my lens by 2 stops to f8, and now I'm properly exposed. See, it's pretty easy. However, we can actually complicate this further. I know that sounds kind of negative, but trust me, it's actually useful. Based on the concept of reciprocity I just explained to you, how you can double your shutter speed and open up your aperture, or vice versa, we can shift these. So let's say, I'll explain with this one, because this one is a bit easier to explain with. It's more visual. Let's say now we're at ASA 100. We have an ASA or ISO 100 film. Well, I'm going to start with my shutter speed set to 100. 100, there we go. And let's say it's sunny. So I'm going to set my aperture to f16. It says f16 right there. So now that's going to be my proper exposure for f16 at 1/100th of a second. Oh no, it's cloudy again. Darn it. Those same clouds rolled in. Well, I'm going to open up my lens to f8. We can actually take a look at that real quick if we want. See, it's a little bit more open than what we just had it at, which was f16. So now I'm properly exposed for that. However, I really want to maintain sort of that depth of field that I had before. So what I can do is, instead of shifting down to f8, I can add 2 stops from my shutter. So I'm going to slow down my shutter to 1/25th of a second. So now I remain at f16, but I have a 25th of a second rather than a 100th of a second. So I got proper exposure using not the standard settings. If this sounds a bit confusing to you and you need more practice, just stick to keeping your shutter speed at whatever your ASA is, or as close as possible to it, and these 4 numbers. This will not let you down. This is every professional photographer that can gauge exposure just with their eyes is using this rule. Also, there's one last thing to remember. It is always, always, always better to overexpose your film than underexpose your film. Because if you underexpose your film, the data that you need to form an image isn't reaching the film in the first place. So always err on the side of overexposure. If you don't know which one to use, you don't know, oh, is it hazy or is it actually sunny? Just use the wider aperture or slower shutter speed. Always round down. Anyway, if you don't want to use that, eventually you'll be able to use like a proper exposure meter. This is one here. This is kind of a vintage one. You'll see if I cover the light sensor, the needle kind of moves around, and you can. This one actually will tell you what kind of settings to use, but I always recommend to people learning that they don't use a light meter. They learn to judge exposure, at least outdoors, by eye, because once you learn that skill, that's a very, very useful skill, and you'll never regret learning this. This is something that you want to learn from the outset. And also, be sure to learn in manual mode, not auto mode. Auto mode does not teach you. Manual mode teaches you. Well, anyway, I've spoken for long enough. I hope that you have learned a little bit about exposure and how to set your settings on your camera. Um, and yeah, that should be about it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the question box below. See you next time.